Right now we have Dr. Richard Birdsey. He is a distinguished scientist with the U.S. Forest Service and program manager in the Northern Research Station. Dr. Birdsey is a specialist in quantitative methods for large-scale forest inventories and has pioneered the development of methods to estimate national carbon budgets for forest lands from forest inventory data. He'll be talking to us about current resources for estimating and maintaining forest carbon today. And with that, you can take it away, Dr. Birdsey.
Oh, thanks very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Here for the last webinar of a long day of webinars. This session was originally scheduled for tomorrow in the forestry part, but I'm not available tomorrow, so the organizers kindly allowed me to give the talk today. So without any additional introduction, here's an outline of the talk. I'm really going to focus on inventory and monitoring of forest carbon and how to make the estimates, why we make the estimates, how we do it. I'll give some examples of the different kinds of resources and tools that are out there and readily available for use. And toward the end, to give a little bit of a vision of what's on the horizon and some of the things that we've learned over the years from doing this kind of work. First thing to take a look at is the complexity of forest ecosystems and the kinds of changes that they are subjected to and the dynamics within the ecosystem. You'll notice on this diagram, which is actually a simplified diagram of the stocks and flows, that there's a lot of parts here. A lot of stocks, the trees, the litter, the roots, the soil, and so forth, and then a lot of flows between the different parts and between the ecosystem and the atmosphere. In the end, we're mostly concerned about the exchange between the ecosystem and the atmosphere because, after all, our concern is the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that are accumulating in the atmosphere. And so in the end, we focus a lot on the exchange between the ecosystem and the atmosphere. But we often do this by measuring the change in stocks on the land. Why do we do this? There's a number of reasons, and they depend a little bit on who wants the information and what they're reporting about. Listed some of the main ones here. We have a national inventory, as most countries do, that's reported annually of the greenhouse gas emissions and sinks for not just forests, but all sectors of the economy. The estimates are useful for assessing and monitoring climate change mitigation activities. They're also used in a strategic way to develop programs such as RED+, which stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and the plus stands for Sustainable Forest Management. The measurements and estimates can be used to support participation by various entities in carbon markets and registries. And finally, but not least important, is learning about forests and understanding their processes, how we manipulate them, what happens, how disturbances affect them, and so forth. And I note at the bottom that the methods and tools may be a little bit different for each of the purposes listed here. There's a lot of guidance for how to make estimates. Probably the highest level is the guidance developed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, known as IPCC. And these are developed by panels of experts and generally labeled, quote, good practice guidance under a category called land use change, and forestry. The IPCC methods have to deal with all countries around the world that have a variety of capacities for making the estimates, and so they offer a choice of estimation methods that range from fairly simple approaches that use factors and generic variables coupled with course level quote activity data, which is land cover maps and information about land use change and so forth, to much more complex methods such as we use here in the United States, where we have a continuous forest inventory, fairly advanced in modeling, and we can repeat these estimates consistently over time to get quite accurate estimates for the nation and for subcategories such as states or different forest types. As you might expect, the Tier 3 methods, the most complicated ones, are the most expensive to implement. We also have guidelines developed by Department of Agriculture with a lot of input from the Forest Service and other agencies within the department and elsewhere. Here's a publication recently came out where the methods were tailored to entity scale inventories. Entity meaning the groups that might be interested in reporting, and they might be an individual forest landowner or a timber company or a state. Hesitating a minute because the slide's not advancing. There we go. Okay, these are the basic elements for now it did two. Let me go back one. Here, I guess I shouldn't hit it twice if I get impatient. These are the basic elements for observing and estimating terrestrial carbon dynamics. We have remote sensing and mapping, which are large-scale, wall-to-wall estimates. We have networks of national inventory sample plots. In the case of forests, the main one is the Forest Inventory and Analysis Program of the U.S. Forest Service. We have intensive measurement sites and chronosequences, and these are more specialized studies that are undertaken on smaller areas, but the measurements are very detailed. And then all of this information is brought together using several different kinds of models, empirical or process models and carbon accounting systems. And I'll illustrate all of these briefly. Here shows the kind of information we get from the three main categories of observations. From remote sensing, we are able to track quite carefully changes in land cover, leaf area, disturbances, and with particularly with the more recently available LiDAR remote sensing, we can get direct measurements of stand structure. Our forest inventories, which are carried out across the land at many, many different sample locations, we can get all the variables collected from remote sensing instruments, and in addition, a lot more detail about live biomass, about species composition, about growth, removals, mortality, and even below ground measurements such as the carbon in soil. And we get the most information from the intensive sites. So these are variables that are impractical to measure over a great many sample plots, yet provide necessary information about all of those carbon pools and fluxes that I showed initially. And so we can get estimates, for example, of litter fall, the CO2 flux from the soil. We can look at dissolved organic carbon by sampling streams. And with eddy flux towers, we can directly measure the exchange of carbon dioxide between the forest and the atmosphere. So we have a lot of data to work with, various scales, but to bring it all together and develop credible estimates, we need to use a variety of models, and most systems use all of these in some way or another. We have empirical models describing the statistical relationship between variables we can observe and the variables we really want to know about. For example, we can measure tree diameters easily, but it's quite difficult to weigh every tree, and so we use a biomass equation to convert the diameter to a biomass estimate. We have ecosystem process models, which represent our understanding of biological, chemical, or physical processes and attempt to quantify relationships among variables based on their drivers or causal mechanisms. These models are important for parts of the system that we might not have good measurements for, or they're very sparse measurements, particularly things like soils, or if we want to extrapolate beyond areas where we've measured to areas that we've not measured, process models are often used for that purpose. And finally, we have the carbon accounting models. It's usually a mixed bag of approaches that are used specifically to relate the data and models and model results we have to the specific reporting requirements that are targeted. MRV in the last bullet reports to measurement, reporting, and verification systems. So the carbon accounting models are critically important to create the information that is required by whoever the reports or estimates are headed to. And we don't want to forget about the importance of having a good data management and analysis system. This underlies and supports our ability to manage, distribute, and archive the data. It facilitates the collaborative use and dissemination of information between partners, and very important that the measurements or estimates can be recreated by an independent party in order to verify that the results are appropriate, accurate, and using the most current available methods. Here's an example of how all these pieces fit together, how we take data from our forest inventories, from remote sensing, and from intensive sites. Each of those blue boxes may have some models embedded in them. All that information will feed into some sort of a carbon accounting model here in the center of the diagram, and then this information is used to produce the results that are required. I list several things. The baseline represents the changes that have occurred at a point in time or a period in time, or sometimes it can be a projected baseline. Additionality refers to the effects of taking some action and changing that expected baseline. So it might be a management scenario or a climate scenario, and then of course the scenarios are defined by the user according to the purpose of making the estimates. So I think that's all of the one more here that also very important part of the estimation system, and that's referred to by the word attribution. Now, our inventories and remote sensing can observe what's happened on a forest landscape or a terrestrial landscape, but cannot always clearly describe what the drivers are, what's really causing the observed changes. And so some additional effort is often required to really focus on what's causing the changes we see in the carbon stocks or fluxes. And part of the issue here is to target what humans can do to change the system. What can we do to manage differently to increase carbon stocks or reduce the emissions of carbon, and separate the human impacts from natural causes such as climate variability or natural disturbances such as fire or insects. And so separating these causes out is very important and usually requires a fair bit of modeling, especially or estimating things like the effect of increasing carbon dioxide on forests or changes in nitrogen deposition. An important one on that list that I just showed was methodological inconsistencies. And I mentioned that one because if you're trying to do a time series and the methods have changed over time, then there need to be adjustments made to account for those differences. And that usually involves recalculating prior estimates to current standards in order to have a consistent time series. So I'm going to give now some examples at national, regional, and state level assessments. I'll talk a little bit about support for the National Forest of the U.S., and then briefly touch on some of the voluntary carbon standards that are out there and some of the other work that's going on internationally. First and foremost is the U.S. Greenhouse Gas Inventory. This is compiled annually by the Environmental Protection Agency for reporting to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, following the guidelines I described earlier. The United States prepares this report. The U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis staff has been providing the estimates for the forest sector since 1991, so this is a long-running activity. And then EPA compiles this kind of information from all of the sectors, including forestry, agriculture, land use change, emissions from using fossil fuels and industrial processes and so on. So EPA prepares a very comprehensive report. This is a very strategic use of the information. It establishes the national baseline. It's the kind of information used in climate negotiations because it establishes what the United States has been doing, what the trends are, and is a basis for making projections in the future and doing strategic analyses of mitigation options. And then the Department of Agriculture periodically, roughly every 5 years, produces a somewhat more detailed greenhouse gas inventory report that goes into more depth than is found in the EPA reports. And that includes data by state, by ownership group, and by forest type. So again, that kind of more detailed information is very useful for developing mitigation programs. And here's what that data looks like from last year's report. In the lower left is a chart that shows the annual estimates compiled from 1990 through 2012. There's a dip and then a rise in the middle of that chart, and that's an example of some methodological inconsistencies that took place around the year 2000 when forest inventory and analysis underwent some significant changes. And so I generally look at the more recent years as being consistent, and then the earlier years as also being consistent, but there's a period in there that's been very difficult to adjust. But recently, you can see that U.S. forests have been a pretty consistent carbon sink, roughly a little under 250 teragrams per year being taken up by forests, and that's enough to offset roughly 12% of the emissions of carbon dioxide from the use of fossil fuels. In the upper right of the chart shows the carbon stocks by different carbon pools, and so the most carbon is in biomass and soil organic matter, and the least amount in dead wood, litter, and harvested wood. However, when you look at the changes, and I don't show that here, but the most dynamic carbon pools are probably biomass, followed by dead wood, harvested wood, and litter. And so even though some of these aren't as great as the soil organic carbon, they are quite dynamic. And the uncertainty roughly estimated at about plus or minus 20%, and that's really not bad for this type of reporting system, and it's what you get with a Tier 3 estimation process. And here's another chart that shows how that information becomes the basis for analysis of future changes. In this chart, I've extended the time series back to 1950. This is not reported in the greenhouse gas inventory, but some additional analysis allows us to go back further in time. And then there's two different projections shown here. The red bars show the Resources Planning Act projections that are based on a continued high rate of land use change, of forests being converted to other uses, shopping malls, power lines, and so forth, and a fairly significant increasing demand for bioenergy that creates more timber harvest. The green bars show a different set of projections that do not have an increase in harvest, and there's no deforestation allowed, but take account of increasing carbon dioxide and nitrogen deposition effects, which tend to increase the productivity of the forest, and also climate variability, which in most regions of the country also tends to increase carbon stocks based primarily on longer growing seasons, but in some areas like southwestern United States is projected to cause a reduction in carbon stocks because of drought and other negative interactions between climate and other factors. Probably the truth for the future is somewhere between these green bars, which represent the maximum, and then the red bars, which suggest that the U.S. forest carbon sink will decline and actually become a source after several decades. Focusing a little bit more at the scale of a land manager, there are different sources of information that are available to support their needs, and I'll go briefly into each of these. The Green Book, which we often refer to as a standard set of tables, these were compiled some years ago. There's maybe 150 or so tables here. They've been very popular over the years because they're easy to use. There's tables that represent different forest types within different regions, and some simple sorts of management, such as leaving a forest alone or doing some clear-cut harvesting and then regenerating. But they show the different carbon pools, the major ones that are used for reporting, and according to age class. And so this information provides a flexible way to do simple simulations about how much carbon can be taken up by different forests in different parts of the country. So they're good rough estimates to give people an idea of the growth rates and how much carbon may be taken up. There's a carbon online estimator known as COAL that produces the same estimates, but they are tailored a little bit more to user needs. So a user may select smaller areas and identify specific forest types or forest conditions and generate the same sets of tables for their particular use. COAL is becoming obsolete. The information is no longer being updated. It's still available on the web, but is being replaced by the next slide, which shows forest inventory and analysis tools, the main one being known as EVALIDator, which queries the Forest Inventory Database, or FIADB. And like coal, it allows users to produce estimates tailored to their specific needs. It's a little bit more complicated to use than coal, but not terribly difficult. There's user guides that allow a user to understand all of the different options available. And I think I'll skip the additional detail in this chart other than to say it's based primarily on P2 data, which is our national inventory sample of about 150,000 sample plots. So there's a lot of data that can be accessed using this system, and it provides a lot of flexibility for someone to make estimates for their conditions. And finally, I wanted to mention the Forest Vegetation Simulator. This is maintained by the U.S. Forest Service, and it's the most widely used forest growth model in the country. There are many different regional variants as shown on the map, and they include localized equations for predicting growth, mortality, volume, according to a large range of forest management practices, such as thinning, or natural disturbances such as insect attacks. And not too long ago, a group of us worked with the FVS staff to embed a carbon calculator within FVS that uses the same methodologies that I've shown earlier for the National Forest Inventory. So you get the same standards are used in the FVS carbon reports that allow all of the simulations that would normally be done by the Forest Vegetation Simulator to produce carbon estimates based on those simulations. Generally, the simulations from FVS are done at the stand level, and then you can have thinnings, burns, harvests, and so forth, and it produces estimates of what happens to the forest and then how much carbon is removed by those processes. And then here's an example of the kind of report. Well, this is the harvested wood products report, a very important part of the calculations, because one can't assume that just because timber is removed from the forest that it is immediately emitted to the atmosphere. The wood products remain in use for, in many cases, decades. For example, the wood in furniture or houses, and some of that wood that's removed is also used for energy, and that can be another very important part of the calculations. So here's an example of the kinds of analysis that can come out of the FVS system or systems similar to that. It shows in the blue line here what happens to a stand if no action is taken, and then there's two alternates. The yellow line shows let me go with the pink or purple line that shows what happens in the forest with a shelter wood harvest, and then the yellow line shows what happens when you also include the carbon stored in harvested wood products. So you can see that the difference between the yellow and the pink or purple line is significant enough that it shows that it's important to keep track of the carbon in harvested wood products. Okay, here's a few more examples. The FVS model is national, and there are variants, as I mentioned, for lots of places. This example is for the Oregon, the area in Oregon, the East and West Cascades. Very nice forest sector carbon calculator produced by Oregon State University and with support from the U.S. Forest Service. There are many others of these around, so in your region you might look around for those. Here's another tool developed by Chaley Hoover of the U.S. Forest Service, and this is targeted specifically to provide estimates of carbon in harvested wood products based on user defined input data. And I wanted here to highlight a little bit about another aspect of the carbon accounting that I'm not going to discuss much other than to point out its importance, and that is the substitution effect. Substitution effect refers to using wood for energy to displace the use of fossil fuels. And so there's two ways that happens. One is the direct substitution of bioenergy or biomass for fossil fuels, and the other is if developing products from wood that can be substituted for products that might use more energy to produce, for example, cement or aluminum products, there can be an energy savings. And as you can see from this chart, those two shades of purple represent these two categories of substitution effects, and they can be very substantial. However, the methods to estimate those quantities are not as advanced as estimating the other components of ecosystems and harvested wood products, and so it's an area that we want to look at for the future to see some improvements that make more user-friendly ways to do that. The reason it's complicated is you have to estimate not only what's going on in the forest sector, but then also the sector that's being substituted for. So you need estimates often referred to as a life cycle analysis of what you're substituting for. In the examples I said earlier, if you're looking at cement or some aluminum product, you need to know also that whole life cycle. So it becomes a rather complicated set of calculations. Here's an example. Let's see my time. I got about 10 more minutes here. For the project we've got going on for assessing carbon stocks on national forest of the United States. And typically we're doing a baseline assessment, which is, in this case, our past changes and the causes of change. And then we're looking at the future, the effects of changing land management, climate, and disturbance. And the methods are listed on the right. I mentioned all of them except for the process model, which we're using to particularly target impacts of climate change, CO2 fertilization, and nitrogen deposition on the estimates. And by separating all of those out, we can focus then on the disturbance and management impacts, which are what the national forests are particularly interested in exploring. This information can be used for supporting the forest planning process as well as at the project level on specific actions. And just a note here that the national forests of Region 8 have been completed, but we haven't released those results yet. They're still being reviewed, and we're still trying to determine how best to communicate this information. I'm losing my ability here to advance the slides. I don't know why it's not showing up for me. There it is. So I'm going to give an example from the Flathead National Forest. If I can get my, oh, there it goes. So we used a tool that I hadn't described, it's mostly used internally, called the carbon calculation tool. It's used specifically to develop estimates for the EPA greenhouse gas inventory used by FIA, but we did some special runs for the national forests. So this is the forest inventory estimates for the Flathead National Forest. It shows the increasing total carbon stock over time and how the different carbon pools have changed. Looking to, sorry, I'm having trouble advancing the slides here, and the little button's not showing up. Well, there it goes. We used a model developed by Sean Healy of FIA in the Rocky Mountain Station that, based on remote sensing and disturbance histories, looks at the impact of various kinds of disturbances, in this case fire, harvest, insects, and diseases. You can see we highlighted the effects of a couple of large fires at the Flathead National Forest. And those are cumulative charts, but you can see that fire in this case is quite dominant. And then this shows all of the different estimates together with the chart in the upper left based on the process model showing the historical effects of climate variability, which are quite significant on the changes in carbon stock, and then the effects of carbon dioxide and nitrogen deposition, which have been slowly increasing over time, climate effect being slightly negative, and then the disturbance effect is in the upper right. We've had increasing disturbances in this example, and so the impact has been getting larger over time, and then combining all factors shows that the carbon stock change has been slightly negative in recent years. Note that this is not the same result as produced by our forest inventory, and there are some reasons for those differences that I don't quite have time to explain. I'll simply say that the models in remote sensing are a little bit more sensitive to changes at the current time, whereas the inventories, particularly out west, have a bit of a lag effect. Then very briefly, I'm nearly done here, I'm going to mention one or two other systems. There's a number of voluntary carbon standards out there. Each has some unique accounting rules and guidelines that include who and what kinds of work might be eligible. And each of these need to be studied carefully to understand what methods they allow and what the reports need to include. There's 5 of them listed here. There are many more, but these are 5 of the more important ones, or the more widely used ones that are out there. Some other agencies have some pretty nice tools that may be useful. This is something developed by NOAA called the Carbon Tracker. It's based on direct measurements of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere and can answer questions such as, if the United States or the world were to embark on a significant effort to reduce the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, do we really see any effect? So it's kind of a verification approach that is based on direct measurements rather than, for example, in the forestry sector, where we can indirectly estimate the impacts of our actions on atmospheric CO2. So this would take a look at how have all of the actions combined made an impact. And you can see that here they are able to do some separation of factors. So the brown bars on the top of the graph show how fossil fuel emissions have changed annually since 2000. The green bars at the bottom show the carbon sinks in the land, primarily forests, and then the red bars, which are rather small here, show the direct emissions from forest fires, primarily forest fires, but all natural fires. And then there's a lot of work going on internationally. It's worth knowing about these things. This is one example called Voluntary from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. And they've been compiling biomass equations for quite a few years now and have a large number of them that can be queried and used by landowners. So just to mention a few things about the future, NASA has a very significant CMS or carbon monitoring system program that seeks to increase the use of remote sensing based estimates. Our Forest Inventory and Analysis program has an aggressive research activity to improve the estimates, to base the estimates more on direct measurements and less on models. And they are also looking at new methods to estimate changes in carbon stocks for smaller areas that would be more appropriately used by different reporting entities. As I mentioned earlier, there are groups trying to develop better tools to estimate the effects of burning wood for energy and substituting wood products for other products. A number of groups are trying to improve methods for working with multiple landowners at a landscape scale. It's sometimes referred to as aggregation, and that makes the whole process a little bit more efficient rather than working on small tracts with individual owners. And then there's work going on to improve methods for attribution to different factors, such as I mentioned, carbon dioxide, fertilization, and so forth. Some of the lessons we've learned over the years: it's firstly very important to understand the reporting and methodology requirements of the system that you're working with. Otherwise, you might be presenting information that's not particularly useful. Don't underestimate the cost of making forest carbon estimates. There are some simple tools out there that can be used, but they might not provide the information you want. There's lots of carbon calculators out there. Some of them are good ones, but the user really needs to be careful. You might look up some reviews. I know there's a review coming out in the Journal of Forestry pretty soon that will evaluate a number of carbon calculators that are available in the United States, so you might look for that. And then it always helps to call someone who might be knowledgeable about the different tools and which might be appropriate in different circumstances. So with that, I think I'm done. The last slide will pop up. Yes, and here's a few other things you might look at. I'm sure this slideshow will be available. I covered a lot of material, and probably not all of it was intelligible, so I'd certainly be glad to answer questions now or at any time afterwards. I'm not hard to find. Thank you very much.